And we are back. So, with Peanut Gallery talking about the gift of the gods, I want to talk about more as a part of Pioneer Era Wrestling, because it's something that you all want me to talk about. And I want to talk about one of the first big signings.
Let me preface this by saying that he had another topic that was very similar and went off of the gift of the gods, but he decided against it.
Yes, I did. Because this one was actually somewhat requested more, and I'm like, you know what, let's do it. Stanislaus Zbyszko, and I'll just say Stanislaus Zbyszko, which is not his actual name. He was a Polish strongman, an amateur wrestler, and a professional wrestler back in, his heyday was like the 1920s. So he's a Pioneer Era wrestler. He, a three-time world heavyweight champion, and he was in one of the highest marquees in the Goldust Trio era of wrestling. When the three Goldust Trio members, Billy Sandow, Toots Mondt, and who was the other one? Ed Strangler Lewis, Toots Mondt, and Billy Sandow. When they formed the Goldust Trio to organize professional wrestling, they scoured the globe and acquired some of the best amateur wrestlers and taught them in what we know of as catch-can style wrestling, which was the more flashier stuff with the suplex and the clothesline side headlocks, right? Right. One of their first big signings, the one person they really wanted to because of this guy's reputation, was Zbyszko. So really, he was really one of the first big-time signees. The surname Zbyszko was only a nickname at first, actually. It was given to his friends for his bravery when he was a child, and it was actually named after a fictional medieval Polish knight from the historical novel The Knights of the Cross by Henryk Sienkiewicz. Did I do well? Okay.
Sorry. There's also a saint in Catholic sainthood called Saint Stanislaus.
Yeah. So Zbyszko.
I think it's the same.
It's the same spelling and pronunciation, right? He was also one of the first recorded brother wrestlers with Wojtek Zbyszko as his older brother. He rose in the ranks in Europe as a greco-roman wrestler. He won multiple titles, including he was one of the first people to actually give a challenge to Frank Gotch back in Europe. Nice. So it was a European championship, and it was he fought Frank Gotch in a 1-hour draw in November of 1909. And the terrible Turk Yusuf Mahmut, I butchered that immensely, thus confirming his reputation among the world elite grapplers. Now, this is before he actually debuted in wrestling, which was actually in 1910. So this was his second encounter with Frank Gotch in the Chicago Coliseum on June 1st, 1910, and this was for the undisputed world heavyweight champion. Okay. In the rematch, Gotch tricked Zbyszko, jumping him when Zbyszko walked out for what was Europe in customary handshake. So you handshake, you go back, and then you start the match. But Gotch jumped Zbyszko before that happened, and he pinned him in 6 seconds.
Interesting.
And this is when Zbyszko already had a huge name, and he was already signed at this point. Right. So Zbyszko was incredibly mad, right? And he protested the result. But the match went on, and Gotch took the second fall in just under 30 minutes. And this was, best out of 5, or best out of 3, pardon. Well, it was one of the two. The performance led to many of them believing that actually this was the first worked match, because they believed that Zbyszko was better than Gotch at this time. And although Gotch would never face Zbyszko again during his career at this point either, because this is when Gotch was leaving, and Zbyszko was the young, high, mighty bro, right? Right. So he faced everybody from Ed Strangler Lewis, which we'll actually talk about that wrestling controversy again because it's very important as a part of his career, to the great Gama, who was an undefeated champion in Persia. So he's a Persian wrestler, and actually one of the first marquee Middle Eastern wrestlers in American wrestling ever was the great Gama. This guy was, enormously powerful because he used those Persian. What are those things that the Iron Sheik uses where he swings them over his head? He was the first one to. He was the first one to introduce those things. They look like bowling pins, but each one of them were like 75 pounds, and like you swing it over your head. He was the first one to actually introduce that to America as a part of training regiments. So that was kind of neat. Zbyszko challenged Gotch multiple times to a match, but obviously Gotch was pretty much done. He finally faced the great Gama again for 250 pounds, and now this is 1910, 250 pounds, so this is actually quite a bit of money, and for something called the John Bull World Championship, and this is in London, and I will be talking about the John Bull World Champion because that whole thing is a can of worms that has actually led to a lot of great wrestlers that we know and love today. The one thing is that Zbyszko wrestled him to a draw for nearly 3 hours. 3 hours straight wrestling. Zbyszko was very much a methodical wrestler. He was not tenacious at all. He was actually very much more of a scientific wrestler. Think of He was much larger, actually. He was very large. He was a much larger version of Zack Sabre Jr., if I can give it that. Maybe not as tenacious, but definitely more of a scientific wrestler. And that was something that the Goldust Trio really appreciated about him and why they really wanted him to work. Now, that was his amateur. By the time that happened, the industry grew to what we know of, and he was recruited back to the United States after the whole thing with Gama and a bunch of other amateur wrestlers in Europe. And now this is 20s going into the 30s. He went back to the United States to finish off his career with the Goldust Trio, Ed Strangler Lewis, Billy Sandow, and Toots Mondt. Now, he was in his early 40s by this time. So really a lot of his career was amateur wrestling with some pro wrestling for tours only. Because he faced people like Gotch. He was booked to, now this is the controversy, right? Zbyszko, this is when, because the Goldust Trio were the first people to incorporate worked finishes to matches as a part of booking, right? Zbyszko was booked to defeat Lewis for the World Championship on May 6th, 1921. But his reign was ultimately a bust at the box office for some reason because actually they believe that the scientific wrestling of Zbyszko was a clash against American wrestling because they were seeing Lewis, Sandow, and Mondt as the marquees because they were the ones doing clothesline suplexes, the big moves that we know now, whereas Zbyszko was more tied down to holds, and he was very traditional, and it was something that was hard to translate back then, but also part of being Polish did not help him. He was actually one of the first big heels because, unfortunately, that whole thing, he was actually called the Strong Polak. So, I just love old era wrestling. So, through the early, so he was also booked to defeat Lewis for that in 1921, but he dropped it back to Lewis on May 3rd of 1922. A reign that is actually very, very short. Around that time, a disagreement caused Joe Stretcher to split from the Goldust Trio's promotion and formed a separate wrestling faction. And this is, man, I guarantee you, if you think AEW and WWE were bad, this is where, people, killed each other. Legitimately. So, this is kind of what happened here. With Joe Stetcher's let go of the Goldust Trio promotion, he started his own. And Zbyszko remained with the trio, despite Stecher really wanting him to go.
Right.
But the trio, the Goldust Trio promotion, were really promoting ex-football player Wayne Munn as a charismatic new champion, much younger as well, because Zbyszko at this time was in his 40s.
Right.
In order to build up Munn's credibility, the trio booked Munn to successfully defend the title against Zbyszko on April 15th, 1925.
Right.
However, Zbyszko had secretly accepted a payoff from Tony Stecher, which is Joe Stecher's brother and manager, to switch to their company. Now, Zbyszko is the marquee villain at this time, and Munn was their champion.
Right.
So, obviously, they booked him to win, right? Zbyszko betrayed the trio by turning the match with Munn into a legitimate shoot because Zbyszko had that credibility as a shoot wrestler, and Munn was a football player, so he knew he was going to win.
Right.
Pinning the non-wrestler again and again and again until the referee was forced to award the title to the 47-year-old veteran who dropped the title to Stecher a month later to complete the play. So Stecher, the guy who separated out from the faction, betrayed the Goldust Trio, which is something unheard of because this is this is McMahon right here. I mean, Toots Mondt booked wrestling with Jess McMahon back in the 20s, for God's sake. So really, this whole thing. So this was the first thing about that work shoot double cross in wrestling that we know of today, and it really put Zbyszko as a top villain.
Yeah.
The last name is incredibly similar because Larry Zbyszko used that last name and did something very similar with Bruno Sammartino, betraying him, becoming the biggest heel. He chose Zbyszko as a last name because this was just around where the older generation knew Zbyszko as one of the most controversial wrestlers at the time. And really, Zbyszko, even other than Larry, he's kind of lost in time, and I find this really sad because a lot of this double cross and really putting on a person who was signed because of their marquee name before, and it's very important to wrestling now. Luckily, the name has been somewhat wiped. He's getting a lot more attention. He is in multiple Hall of Fames, WWE Hall of Fame. He is in their Pioneer Wing. He is in the Wrestling Hall of Fame's Pioneer Wing. And I just kind of wanted to bring out a little bit more about Stanislaus Zbyszko and his legacy, and I think it's something that should be kind of put up there.
All right, great.
Yeah, so without further ado, let's go into our next part, which is going to be covering AEW Revolution.
When we come back from the break, so stay tuned.
Yeah.